Welcome to another book review. I'm ahead of the curve, and in this discussion video I'll be talking about Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago, and this was written and published in 1973. Solzhenitsyn was a Russian author, philosopher and historian, and he's most well known actually for this book in particular, because it is the book that exposed primarily Stalin's regime, the Soviet death camps, and this is made up of, based on the testimony of over 200 survivors of this, the camps, and so it's very long. Not as long as the unabridged edition, which is over 1,000 pages, as far as I'm aware. Let's get into it. My particular edition that I have right now is by Vintage Classics, and the introduction is written by Jordan P. Peterson, which many of you will know from me either mentioning him before in previous videos, or by you reading him yourself, because he's very popular at the moment. And the introduction is brilliant, I must admit. Peterson is a bit heavy on the religiosity of his claims and his anecdotes, but apart from that, and you know, that is Peterson. I mean, he's very religious in his language, and that isn't something I hate, but it's something that I feel that is a bit heavy, especially in his 12 Rules for Life, which again is heavy with religion when it doesn't necessarily need to be. It's a very articulate introduction. Peterson manages to bring out the philosophical, existential, political tones and themes out of the piece before you read it. And so he kind of primes you to look out for certain things, which I enjoyed actually. It didn't spoil anything by any means. In fact, I read this book because of Jordan Peterson mentioning it in various interviews and lectures. And I think if you go on his website as well, this will be on the top of the list for his greatest books recommendations. And so, and by the way, I've literally read probably over 5 of his recommended books at this point, and I must say all of them have been solid. And to put simply, I was not disappointed by this. I think it's quite dense, but it's profound reading. It's a piece of literature that everybody should be exposed to. But you know, with a piece of history, a historic book, non-fiction recounting events, it can get a bit too nuanced. And that isn't a criticism of the piece. You can't blame Solzhenitsyn for just being detailed in what he's saying, because again, this is a book about a historic time, about historic events. And so I don't blame him for that, and that isn't a disadvantage of the piece. Although it's just a personal setback for me, because some chapters were definitely less interesting than others. And so that led to me skimming a lot of the time. But when it was interesting, it definitely was interesting. The parts I liked about the book were probably how the people were treated, the torture sections, and of course the personal anecdotes by Solzhenitsyn himself, which I'd say is a highlight of the piece, because it adds a second layer. You know, it's not just him saying what happened, but it's also him saying what happened to him. And if you've read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, it carries that same kind of weight, that same kind of emotional baggage. And I think that's good, because it alleviates the feel of it being too dense, too heavy. And that is a really good aspect about this book. You really do feel for this guy, because he was in these camps for God knows how long, years. And there were the worst conditions that you could have been in at the time in the world. And so, yeah, I don't think that the length can be seen as something to be put off by. And I'd understand that, because I feel the same. But again, I don't think with all books, like non-fiction especially, I think exclusively non-fiction, you don't have to read the whole piece. You could just pick and choose what chapter you want to read and learn about. So you could do the same with this. And that's kind of what I did at points, because I really wasn't interested in certain things that there were so much details about. And funnily enough as well, this is, as I said, the abridged edition. So I can't imagine how many nuances, how many details are in the longer version. Now, if you're familiar with my Instagram page, then you'll know the first quote because I posted it and I did a analysis of what it might mean and my interpretation of the words. But I'm going to read out a couple quotes that I liked, that I wanted to share with you. There are quite a lot actually, because Solzhenitsyn becomes very existential throughout, and he really does offer some very terrifying and interesting philosophical anecdotes. And so here we go, I'll share the first one. Darkness renders a person more sensitive to light. Involuntary inactivity in imprisonment arouses in him a thirst for life, movement, work. The quiet compels profound pondering over his own I, and I mean the I as in ourselves, over surrounding conditions, over his own past and present, and forces him to think about his future. So I don't want to go into this too deeply, because maybe I'll just get you to head over to my Instagram if you haven't already seen it, and to read my analysis of it. So maybe you can do that, and for the second one I'll talk more about what I think it means. So the next passage I'm going to read out for you, it's interesting because it deals with how these people actually lived through these conditions and their approach, their mental approach to surviving. So what is the answer? How can you stand your ground when you are weak and sensitive to pain, when people you love are still alive, when you are unprepared? What do you need to make you stronger than the interrogator and the whole trap? From the moment you go to prison, you must put your cozy past firmly behind you. At the very threshold, you must say to yourself, my life is over. A little early, to be sure, but there's nothing to be done without it. I shall never return to freedom. I am condemned to die, now or a little later. But later on, in truth, it will be even harder. And so the sooner the better. I no longer have any property whatsoever. For me, those I have loved have died, and for them I have also died. From today on, my body is useless and alien to me. Only my spirit and my conscience remains precious and important to me. Confronted by such a prisoner, the interrogator will tremble. Only the man who has renounced everything can win that victory. But how can we turn one's body to stone? It's a fascinating passage. It just goes to show that to survive, these people had to leave their comfortable old carcass behind in search for a harder skin, to survive the horrors of their new situation. They have to adapt to survive, just like natural selection made us all do, all these beings, all these creatures, all these species do from the beginning of time. And so, yes, the individual had to become somebody else to survive these camps. You may be surprised of the length of this video because of how large this book is, with being over, I believe, 500 pages. You might expect me to say more, because, well, actually it's interesting because I end up saying more about the shorter books, but I think because of the actual genre of what this is, a historical book, if I really wanted to pick out a lot, I really could, and so I'm preserving the amount of time that you may have in your day. And so all I wish to say, though, is that I'm proud that I read this book and that I'm aware of these camps. I'm aware of what happened to these Russians. And that's another thing. This book isn't actually in the curriculum for most schools, apart from in Russia. In Russia, it's actually, you have to read this book. It's allocated reading for Russians. But here in England and in America, for example, it's all about the Nazis and that Holocaust, the Holocaust we all know, right? And I think it's good that we're being taught about the Polish Jews, the German Jews, and the concentration camps that we all know. I think that's good, but it would be nice for these education systems to take into account what happened to the Russians as well. And so that's why I really do appreciate this book being in existence, and I would highly recommend for anyone to read if you feel inclined like I do to be aware of the past and what actually went on, how we got here. So if you are concerned about history, and if you love history, then I would say this is a no-brainer, really. You need to get on this book immediately. But yeah, I think that's brought us to the end of the video. If you've read this book, then please let me know what you thought of it. Remember to check out my Goodreads and my Patreon for benefits such as my writing, some of my short films, and for monthly personal blogs and other things. So there's many benefits you can get on my Patreon, which is linked below, such as I mentioned, my Goodreads, where you can track what books I read. And of course my Instagram, which I mentioned before, which is also linked below in the description. So thank you as always for watching, and I will see you next week. Adios.